How does a person get good at chess? Well, you have to work on all aspects of the game. You have to learn some opening concepts, you have to learn the theoretical endgames that will bring you to a win or help you hold a draw, and you have to learn techniques for attacking and defending. Of course, attacking is the fun part, that's what wins you games, but equally as important is defending against your opponent's threats so you don't lose games. So in this video, we're going to go through some pretty basic but important defensive concepts that I don't think are discussed nearly enough, and I wish somebody had told me these a lot earlier. Let's get right into it. So one of the first tactical vocabulary words that I remember learning is the fork. And I think a lot of times these are illustrated by knight forks because they can often come out of nowhere. But I think what people usually don't learn hand in hand with learning how to find forks as the aggressor is how to stop yourself from falling into fork traps. So of course, in this position with black to move, black can move the knight here, it's attacking the king, it's attacking the rook, and the king is in check, so the king has to move, and the rook will be lost on the next move. So how could have white prevented this in the first place? Well, first of all, something that's easy to remember, especially in time trouble, is if you are scared of getting your pieces forked like this, keeping your pieces on opposite colors makes it so that your opponent's knight can never attack both of them at once, because as you'll see, when the knight jumps here, it can only attack the dark squares. It's got a huge circle of dark squares around it. So if one of these pieces were on a light square, well, then it wouldn't actually be a fork, right? It would only be attacking one of those pieces. So when you've got major pieces that you're trying to keep on the board, it's just good practice to usually keep them on opposite colored squares. I also got so fed up with falling into knight forks like this at a certain point in my chess career that I had this document that I was just compiling like all my chess lessons learned. And I went through and made screenshots of every single position that major pieces could get forked by a knight. I'll just show this briefly, but if you can pay attention to these kind of patterns and positions that I just used rooks as examples, but that you can get your major pieces in, I think this helps in pattern recognition. And so if you notice that your opponent has a knight that's kind of up in your territory, and you have pieces that are in this kind of configuration, or this one, you can maybe consider taking a closer look, and it'll just sort of set off the alarm bells that a fork might be possible. But knights aren't the only pieces that can fork. Again, any piece on the board can attack two pieces at the same time. But I think another common one that often will come out of nowhere is the pawn fork. And so going back to that pattern recognition, if you have pieces that are one square apart like this, or one square apart like this, and you've got pawns that are nearby, it's probably a good idea to consider if your opponent on their next move might be able to fork your pieces. Now, it's also important to take a look at the pieces that would potentially be forked. If black were to play this move, right, this isn't really a fork because this pawn is undefended, and because you have a piece that moves diagonally, so in this case the bishop, it could also be the queen, you can just take it, and it's not actually a fork. Now, if there was a piece defending this pawn, like if there's another pawn here, or if there was a knight here, then this would be a much stronger threat, right? Because then neither of these pieces could capture without being lost. Now, in the case of pushing this pawn forward, neither of these pieces are pieces that can move diagonally, so they cannot capture. It's also important to note that the king is protecting this pawn. In this particular case, we do have a way to get out of it, and often the best way, if you find yourself in a fork, to get out of that fork is to look for any checks that you might have. So in this case, the pawn moved forward, and so now this gave us the chance to check with the rook. And importantly, even if the king moves here, it is protected. So if that weren't the case, then it would kind of almost be another fork because our knight would be under attack and our rook would be under attack by the king, but of course the rook is just protected, so it's fine. We could also go for knight h4 check, and in the event that the king takes and attacks the knight and attacks the rook, we just calmly swing the rook over, protect everything, and it's all good. So again, pattern recognition, just recognizing that your pieces are in this particular configuration. When there's pawns nearby, that's a good thing to keep in mind as far as defense. So in this case, these pawns were sort of isolated, so they couldn't really do anything, but pawn forks can be a lot more dangerous when they are backed up by more of their own, more pawns. So in the opening, this can happen especially if your opponent is pushing a lot of pawns in kind of a funky way. So for example, taking here would be a mistake because this allows black first to take the center, notice that the e-pawn is defended by the f-pawn, and so even though we have a diagonal piece, we can't actually capture this because we'd be taken, by a pawn, not a knight. So after black plays e5, we have to slide our bishop out of the way, but then because these pieces, notice they're in that one square apart configuration again, now this is a lot stronger because it's defended by the d-pawn. Again, this bishop just cannot take, and so this early in the game, these pawn forks can come into play. So it's really important to keep an eye on those things. So what would have been the best way to avoid this? Just not taking this pawn. This was the huge mistake. This pawn is a crucial defender of the e5 square, and especially in d4 openings, that square is particularly crucial right away, just to hold on to the center. And this is another great example of opening principles, right? You don't want to give up center control too early, and allowing black to push in the center just violates those opening principles, but it's also tactical. It comes with this oncoming pawn fork. Now remember, when we were talking about knight forks, we talked about not putting our important pieces on the same colored square. That's important not just to defend against knight forks, but also to defend against things like this. So for example, we move our queen up, attacking the g7 pawn, hoping to give a quick checkmate, but now bang, black slides the bishop back, and suddenly we're about to lose the queen. Because we've lined up the queen with the king on the same colored square, on the same diagonal, and because our opponent had that colored bishop, that's another pattern to look out for. Even if you're not really consciously thinking, okay, does my opponent have this specific move on the next move? It's generally a good idea just to not put your pieces in this particular configuration because of things like this, because of that possibility, even if you don't see it right away. So changing this position just a little bit, we can also illustrate the reason why we don't want our queen and our king lined up this way, like up and down, side to side, things like that. This rook move, absolutely devastating. We're going to lose our queen here, and it's in a pin. There's no way that the queen can move without exposing the king to check, which is just an illegal move. So this is another pattern, another configuration that you should know, that it's probably not a good idea to put your pieces like this. And one last example of pieces lined up in a way that they maybe shouldn't be, and a way that you can defend against things like this. So the king is directly lined up in front of the queen, and there's only one single pawn between them. So this means that this pawn is not protecting anything. So this means that black can just take this pawn, and we can't take it back. They're also threatening checkmate now. So this is a huge problem. Honestly, if it was white to move in this position, or a similar one, a good move might be to just move out of the way. Just get out of this pin, and then it makes it just a little bit easier to play because you don't have to be worried so much about these tactics. In a case like this, though, where you do end up having a bishop and a queen lined up against this pinned pawn, usually one of the best or only ways to defend it is to just push this pawn. It does give up the rook, but at least you're not getting checkmated. But the best way to prevent something like that in the first place is just to start being aware of these kinds of patterns and get your king to safety as quickly as you possibly can. Notice when your opponent is making threats against your castled king or against any of your pieces, and then if you can defend against the threats that your opponent is making and sort of neutralize them, then you can go on the attack yourself once your opponent doesn't have any more forcing moves. But again, as important as it is to know the kind of attacking tactics that exist, it's also equally important to know the defensive techniques that you'll need to use to defend against those tactics. So finally, if you're looking to practice these defensive techniques yourself, one good way to do that is to go through puzzles on a site like chess.com. You can check custom puzzles. There is a little box that you can check that is like defensive puzzles. Another fun way I've heard to practice defense is to just go through the normal random puzzles, but flip the board and then go back to the last move that the opponent played, right? And see if you can see why that was a mistake that allows that tactic, and see if you can find a better defensive move than the so-called computer does in setting up the puzzle for you. If you've got any more of these defensive rules that you or somebody had told you a long time ago, feel free to leave them down in the comments. We're all just sharing knowledge here. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you soon.